Hi, everybody. My name is Reba Epler, and I'm here with Stan Leek and Alan Kirkbride. And I want to talk to you about the groundwater and surface water case that took place in Laramie County, Wyoming. That's a picture of Stan. He's out at a spring, and that's a picture of me. And then Alan and Lindy Kirkbride are ranchers and part of the contestants in the case. In 2019, a family applied for 8 high-capacity irrigation wells in Laramie County. And this is an overview of the proposed wells. They're very large appropriations. They're larger than any appropriation that people have requested in the area ever. And if you add up the total amount of acre feet that would be taken out of the High Plains Aquifer, it's it's 4,642 acre feet. That's a significant amount of water. That amounts to 1.5 billion gallons of water per year. There were 17 contestants in this case opposing the granting of these wells. And there are many ranchers involved. There are people who own small lots that are 40 acre lots. And there are farmers, and then there are ranchers who've got senior surface water rights. There are ranchers who've got springs that originate on their ranch and then flow into larger creeks. And then you've got in Wyoming what you call preferred water rights, stock and domestic wells that are going to be impacted. And people are also concerned about impact to the public interest. I mean, these wells are so large that they would amount to about what the city of Cheyenne uses, a third of what the city of Cheyenne uses. So they're very large. There will be, if they are granted, significant environmental impacts to the area because of the hydrological connection between groundwater and surface water. And people were also very opposed to these because of their speculative nature and that they would hold a monopoly in having such a huge water right. So the entire community came together and filed their oppositions. My family was also part of the opponents, and I represented 8 of the people, and there were 2 other attorneys representing 2 other large ranches, and then there were a couple people that represented themselves in the case. And it took place in Cheyenne in June, and I've got a slide towards the end kind of about the timeline, but I want to get more into the facts of the case. To give you a geological or geographical overview of this is the extent of the High Plains Aquifer. And if you look at that little corner there in Wyoming, there's a part of the High Plains Aquifer that is in Laramie County, Wyoming. And then if you look at those little yellow spots, those are areas where the water levels have declined. And it's, according to this map, it says 10 to 25 feet, but we have areas that the declines have been even greater than that. So the aquifer in general is stressed, and the story is the same in Laramie County, Wyoming. In Laramie County, Wyoming, there you can conform control areas, and this control area, it's called the Laramie County Control Area, was established in 1981 and modified in 2015. And in a control area, you cannot just get unlimited more high capacity wells. You have to go through a process to get them. And there's these specific areas in this conservation area called drawdown areas, and then there are conservation areas. Drawdown areas, you cannot get a new high capacity well, and a high capacity well is defined as greater than 25 gallons per minute. So anything greater than basically a stock and domestic well, you have to go through the application process to get this well. In the conservation area, this 2015 order applies, and it's more liberal in terms of being able to get high capacity wells. And so in Wyoming, there are reasons for establishing control areas, and I'll read those. The use of underground water is approaching or equal to the current recharge rate. Groundwater levels are declining or have declined excessively. Conflicts between users are occurring or are foreseeable. the waste of water is occurring or may occur, and other conditions exist that may or may arise that require regulation for the protection of the public interest. And I'll get more into that public interest standard, but it's a standard that's given to us in our Constitution, and other Western states have the public interest standard given to them as well. So in a geographic sense, Cheyenne is down there. There's I-80 and I-25 that run through southeastern Wyoming, and they intersect in Cheyenne. And then Highway 85 is a US highway, and it runs all the way from Canada to Mexico. And these ranches are located around those red dots. And so those red dots are made on a map by these two hydrology firms, Nearbo and Dahlgren. And this kind of shows you where they are in just a geographical sense. And this is a USGS map, and I encourage everybody to get the USGS maps for their area. They're really helpful in terms of understanding what you call potentiometric surface of groundwater. And every USGS, well, I don't know if it's true if every USGS has mapped all groundwater, but in the High Plains Aquifer, there's been a lot of mapping done because of the stress on the aquifer. And Stan can talk more about these maps, but basically gravity rules groundwater flow, and water is flowing in the direction of the grade of the land. And you can see that there's these gradients of water flow, and where these wells are proposed to be located, the gradient of the flow is sort of in a northeasterly direction. And why that's significant, I believe, is shown in the next slide. Okay, so in this next slide, we show the potentiometric surface. The groundwater is flowing towards springs, and there's a rim. These wells are all located on the rim of the Horse Creek Valley, and then there's a big valley that's just north of there, and the land is significantly lower in elevation, I think 300 feet about elevation difference. So you can see the potentiometric surface is naturally flowing in that direction. So the water is coming out of the ground in these springs, and these are very big springs for the area. And they supply a lot of water to these ranches, and the water continues to flow upstream to a lot of different ranches who use that water to irrigate. And there is a reservoir north of here called Hawk Springs Reservoir that has the right to fill in the wintertime. So any impact to these springs will affect a ton of different users of that water. And this is a nice representation of the concept of potentiometric groundwater surface and the direction of groundwater flow. Again, this is another representation of the direction of that groundwater flow and its relation geographically to the road, the Highway 85. But the point here is that how close these wells are going to be to the springs if they're granted. And that has an impact because of the hydrological connection between groundwater and surface water. This particular picture shows how many stock and domestic wells are around these. These are pretty shallow stock and domestic wells. A lot of them were put in the 60s. Some of them were put in the 20s. Some of them were put in the late 1800s or early teens. And everybody in this area is very dependent on windmills for watering their cattle. And they've got shallow stock wells, and these wells will impact their stock wells and their house wells. And there really aren't very many irrigation wells up in this country because the land is so severely limited for cultivation. This is so the state engineer's office contracted with a company called Amec to create a model. And this is the modeling. This is just the model of the grids. And Stan will talk about this a little bit more, but there are different cells in a model. You've got river cells, which on the very northern boundary of this, there are river cells that are the Horse Creek. So that's the northernmost boundary, which is Big Horse Creek. And then you've got stream cells, which are these littler creeks that feed into the bigger system. And in this modeling, what what they did is they found that the existing wells have an impact, and what they do is they create cones of depression. And these cones of depression are seen by these little circles, and the center of the circle is the deepest. So if you look at any example, like up in District 5, the center represents the deepest cone, part of the cone of depression, 50 feet of drawdown from the water level, and then they radiate outwards. And as we know, because of all this work that Stan has done and his predecessors, that these cones of depression eventually intersect with surface water features. And that's why all these ranchers are so concerned in this case, not only for the water table dropping, but because of the impact to all the springs, because of the lowering of the water table. That's basically what groundwater pumping does. It lowers the water table. We did some modeling using the state's model, and that's significant because the state has acknowledged this model and they have accepted this model. And when you combine the pumping, the existing pumping from those wells that I showed you in the last picture with these new wells, you have really significant groundwater declines that do impact the springs and the creeks. You know, around the wells, you have 50 feet of drawdown, and then the next ring is 25 feet. But those, as you saw from that slide a few slides back, there are so many little house wells and stock wells that are so close to that, that if you drop the water level by, say, 10 feet even, they're going to have to re-drill and go deeper. So all this land is going to be impacted. The water table is going to be lowered, and the intersection with these surface features, so the creeks and the springs won't flow anymore. And that's a huge concern for all these ranchers and all these people who depend on this water. So in Wyoming, in a control area, it said the law says that an application shall be granted and a permit issued after the state engineer finds, after receiving the advice of the Control Area Advisory Board, that one, these are the elements of the statute. One, that there are unappropriated waters of the proposed source. And I'd like to have you think about that term, proposed source. As I get a little bit deeper into this, I'll go into that. Two, that the proposed means of diversion and construction are adequate. And we definitely addressed that at the trial, but I don't have time to get into it. We don't feel that the means of construction or diversion are adequate, but I don't have time to go into the depth with you on this. And that the location of the proposed well does not conflict with any well spacing or well distribution regulation. In this area, the wells have to be located 1.5 miles apart from existing wells. And again, I don't have time to get into it, but these wells are so close to that 1.5 mile line that it's questionable whether they are able to meet that standard. And finally, the one that I find to be so interesting is that the proposed use would not be detrimental to the public interest. And that's a right given to us in Wyoming by the Constitution. So the public has an interest in the water and its administration. And the elements that I'm going to talk about are whether there's unappropriated waters in the proposed source and public interest. Under the first element, whether there's water that's appropriated in the proposed source, the map that I showed earlier, let me go back to that. This map shows that the groundwater and the surface water are essentially interconnected at the springs, at the level of the springs, because in a spring, the groundwater is intersecting with the level of the groundwater. The surface water is at the same level as the groundwater. So, sorry. What's at risk is all this incredible irrigated land. This ranch in particular is called the Petch Ranch, and the Hunter Ranch and the Cattails Ranch. You can see how big this country is, and it's all dependent on this creek. This is Little Horse Creek, and Little Horse Creek irrigates these meadows, and they hay, and they put up all this hay to feed their cattle in the wintertime. And these water rights are very old. They're some of the oldest in the state. This particular ranch has water rights on this creek and these ditches from about 1893. So right around the time of the territory became the state of Wyoming, very old water rights. And the concept that we really hammered in the trial was this hydrological connection between groundwater and surface water. And I find this little chart to be really informative about how groundwater, when groundwater is pumped, it's initially pumped from supply, meaning that it's going to be taken right from the aquifer. But over time, as those cones of depression expand outwards, and they intersect with the surface feature, they start to take water from the surface feature. So in time, the water moves from being storage dominated to being supplied by streams, by surface water. So in time, these water rights are going to be impacted by the pumping. And I love this. I think everybody should remember this little picture. And I've got another really good picture following this. When you put a well in, you know, initially the water's flowing towards the surface features like the springs or the creeks, like it shows in that very top left picture. Then you put a well in, and that's pretty close to a spring or a stream, but nevertheless, it's a good representation that initially you're taking water from storage. You're not taking any water from the surface feature. But as the cone of depression expands, grows, the water table is lowered. So you start to pull water away from the surface feature to feed that well. And the cone of depression creates, it's the law of conservation of mass, and Stan can explain that a lot better than I can. But as the bottom picture shows, which I think is what will happen in this case, and through our modeling, we've shown that you're going to take water out of storage, but then eventually you're going to lower the water table so much that the surface features will be feeding that cone of depression and they won't have any water in it. And that's when you have dried up springs and streams. And from this very good paper, it says that right now about 20 to 40% of the springs and streams and rivers in anywhere there's groundwater pumping are being affected by pumping. But by 2050, that is supposed to grow to almost 80%. So if you can imagine that effect of not having any running water in the environment, it's going to be really hard on people who depend on that water. So from our modeling, we have these predicted outcomes, and the predicted outcomes from the state's model shows that these springs will be affected. I don't want to get into the details of the model, but we showed in the trial that this model is not, the impacts are likely going to happen sooner, and they're going to be more exaggerated than what the modeling itself shows. But I don't have time to get into that right now. But nevertheless, these are pretty significant impacts. And this is a representation of a slice out of the aquifer with just 2 wells, and you can see how the water level is right there at Bull Springs. And those cones of depression will eventually lower the water table. So Bull Springs, it could be any springs, but this is just a representation of Bull Springs, will be impacted by the pumping. So with our really good experts, we had this mapping done, and this is what these cones of depression are going to look like by 2060. The extent is massive. That's how much groundwater pumping, large scale groundwater pumping, can affect a landscape. So you've got all these springs that are to the north, but you've also got all those little stock and domestic wells, which are in yellow around there, and you can't see them very well, and the little black dots represent names of all the people who are contesting these wells, opposing these wells. So as you can see, everyone was rightly concerned that this would impact, and the modeling showed that. So people went on instinct initially, but then we did modeling with our experts, and it showed that everybody is going to be impacted. I can't, Sarah, what's the deal? I can't move. Okay. This is the other question, considering the public interest. And again, that's a picture of the Horse Creek. This is from the Wyoming Constitution. It says priority of appropriation for beneficial use shall be given the better right. No appropriation shall be denied except when such denial is demanded by the public interests. I love that this is granted to us by our Wyoming Constitution. Other Western states have been given this right, but it hasn't been given a lot of credit in the law, but it is a right given in Constitution and by statute. In our groundwater permitting statutes, it says the permit shall not be granted if the proposed use would be detrimental to the public interest. So I want everybody to start thinking about, what is the public interest? Well, in this case, the public interest involves what the impact will be to these ranches. First, you're going to have dried up springs and streams. And these are some young women that a reporter came out and took pictures of. That's Dally Rutledge. And she's on another ranch that's very interested in this and will be impacted. And Kylie Wilson is from the Petch Ranch, and they were involved in this case. And then there's Alan down in the very right-hand corner. And that's a picture of the Utes Ladies Truss orchid, which is an endangered species, and it's dependent on moist subirrigated meadows. That's just a tiny slice of what the public interest is. With respect to these meadows, there was a very famous lawsuit in Nebraska, and we became friends with these ranchers through this case. And it was the Spear T Ranch versus Kanab lawsuit. And in that lawsuit, there were hundreds of pivots upstream from them on Pumpkin Creek in western Nebraska, really just east of where the Lerwicks are proposing to put these wells. Anyway, they went through this massive process of trying to get money damages from losing their creeks, and they talked to us about how, as their creeks were lost, how much wildlife was affected, how they lost so much productivity of their land. And they gave me a lot of exhibits, but I found this one to be really impactful because it shows how land that was formerly subirrigated, comparing it to land that was presently subirrigated in the area, which is very close to our area, you have huge differences in yield and productivity. And it's almost 2 times more tons per acre is produced from lands that are subirrigated compared to those that are not subirrigated. And so by lowering the water table, you're gonna disconnect that connection from that subirrigated meadow. And these ranchers are at huge risk from losing productivity for their subirrigated meadows and riparian areas. So the status of the contested case is that they filed the applications in 2019. The hearing was originally scheduled for March of 2020, but it was continued until June because of coronavirus. We held the 3-day trial in Cheyenne at the Capitol, which I found to be very significant. And after the trial was over, we all submitted our briefing on public interest, burden of proof, and standing in July. And then in August, all the parties submitted their proposed orders. In September, the Laramie County Advisory Board got together and they had a meeting, and they voted no. They voted that the state engineer should deny all these permits. And the reason that they stated was that there is no appropriable water in this area because these particular wells will have so much impact on springs and existing senior water rights that cannot be mitigated through the channels of calling for regulation or even an interference claim. So we are awaiting final decision of this Wyoming state engineer and really hoping that the common sense prevails and that the state is able to recognize that he has to protect senior surface water rights, and he also has to protect the public interest. So that's where we're at. And then just as a summary of why this matters for all of us, I feel that this case is a beautiful nexus between the past and what we're going to be facing in the future because of the impact that groundwater pumping is going to have and is having on surface waters. So what we did in this case is these issues are going to be present everywhere there's groundwater pumping. It wasn't recognized readily in the law that there is an interaction, that groundwater and surface water are one, but in reality they are. And groundwater pumping impacts surface water flows. So these issues are going to become very present as people start to recognize that all this groundwater pumping has dried up all of our creeks and is going to affect our rivers, and we're going to lose a lot of wetlands. And these ranches in the Horse Creek Valley are very special because they're so old. The families have been on the land since, some of them, the 1890s. Alan Kirkbride's family started there about 1900, 1899. So you've got a really beautiful valley with still very intact family businesses. Some of them are the oldest in the state. And that to me it's contrary to the public interest to destroy businesses that have been in existence for so long and have done such good things for the area. We also have to worry about this and be knowledgeable about this because of the health of the environment. I have watched in my lifetime many creeks in the area go dry, and I find it to be totally heartbreaking. I grew up on beautiful ranches, and I spent my entire youth and even today on the land. I love the land, and I don't want to see it destroyed by heedless groundwater pumping for something that is probably, I don't know, we really gonna have to have discussions about what about this type of agriculture that uses so much groundwater to grow crops that probably shouldn't be grown in southeastern Wyoming, like alfalfa and corn. That is a discussion we're going to have to start having. And I heard that on 60 Minutes the other day about how these farmers in Arizona are having to start talking about why are we growing these incredibly water thirsty crops in a place that's so arid. And I think it applies everywhere. So crop type, health of the environment, these are big issues. Then, like I showed the pictures of those gals from those ranches, there's others, and Alan's got lots of pictures, but we have to consider the future. We can't just be a society that says, let's just put wells in and then who cares about the future? Because in Wyoming, as far as I can tell, there is no plan for this issue. And the fact that we put this forward is a very uncomfortable issue for the state engineer's office. And I really like that the community came together to address this issue and bring it to the forth and start talking about how this is the reality. Groundwater and surface water are hydrologically connected, and groundwater pumping affects surface waters. So that's my final point, is that we have to be able to move our governments in the direction of acknowledging that there is the reality of hydrological connection, and that the groundwater resource is not unlimited, as we know, and that we're going to have to start really administering this according to the value of the public interest. So that's my part of the talk. Thank you. Stan is going to go next, and this is a picture of Stan, and I can Stan is going to tell me when to hit the slide button. I think you're muted, Stan.
All right, you can go ahead and advance. As you can see, I live in the desert, and I worked for the U.S. Geological Survey for a long career. And that's how, once I retired, I got connected with REBA for this project to be an expert witness. Okay, go on. The reason that REBA found me was because of this report that I wrote with my colleague Paul Barlow. It's called Stream Flow Depletion by Wells. And this is turning out to be one of the most popular USGS publications. And it's right on point with the issues here with the Lerwick wells. And if you want to find this report, you could just Google stream flow depletion, and it will come up right at the top. Okay, go ahead. So I live in Tucson, and this is a historic picture of the Santa Cruz River looking south from Tucson, taken in 1942. You can see kind of that rock at the bottom in the foreground. And those trees adjacent to the Santa Cruz River are mesquite trees. And this was really good habitat for birds. And so eventually the city of Tucson found this part of the aquifer to be very productive. And so they heavily pumped it. And on the next slide, we can see, go ahead and advance. There's that same rock, and you can see the trees are all gone. They were being sub-irrigated by groundwater. And go ahead and advance. And we have a monitor well nearby. Initially, it was a shallow well, and the water level was about 30 feet below land surface and going down. And then that well, I think, went dry, and there was a new well. You can see that the water table in this area declined to, perhaps more than 150 feet below land surface. And mesquite can send down deep roots, but not that far. Maybe 50 feet is a reasonable depth for mesquite to draw water from. But so that was the difference. This is a case of loss of these trees and the environment that they provided. Okay, next slide. Here's an example from the Central High Plains Aquifer. It's in the Oklahoma Panhandle, the Beaver North Canadian River Basin. And in this part of the High Plains Aquifer, that is, they pump from heavily from the Ogallala Formation. And in the upper graph, you can see groundwater levels have been declining since perhaps 1960, 1970, and have gone down considerably. And stream flow in the river, this is the total stream flow, also has gone down to practically zero by the late 1900s. And then in the bottom graph, this is base flow. And base flow is the amount of water in a stream that's contributed by groundwater. So the other component would be surface water runoff that gets into the stream, but this is just the groundwater part. And you can see that base flow, the amount of groundwater going to the stream, has essentially gone to zero by, well, shortly after 1990. So this is a story that's been well told, and the USGS has a lot of reports on the High Plains Aquifer here and elsewhere. Okay, next slide. So the reasons we're concerned is people need water and are reaching out to groundwater as a source for public supply and agriculture. But there's environmental concerns to protect riparian ecosystems. And also there's legal concerns, which Reba's covered, that pumping groundwater is a way that in a lot of places you can take surface water without having a surface water right. So there's conflicts with existing use surface water rights holders. Next slide. So when you pump a well, initially all the water comes from the loss of storage around the well by creation of a cone of depression, as Reba mentioned. And that means that the water table is going down, water is being drained from the pore spaces in the aquifer material usually. And with increased pumping time, then the drawdown from the well intersects rivers, springs, and also areas with plants that use groundwater to cause an increase of inflow or decrease in outflow to the aquifer. That actually becomes a source of water to the well. And we call that capture. As pumping continues, further loss may decline to zero, and all the pump water will be supplied by increased inflow or decreased outflow. And if you were studying that graph that Reba presented, which I'll show in a minute, you can see that at some point all the water is coming from this increased inflow or decreased outflow. None of it's coming from storage anymore. And then we call that portion of the water that's from increased inflow and decreased outflow as stream flow depletion or capture, as the case may be. Okay, next slide. So just to reiterate, the only sources of water are release of water from aquifer storage and captured water, reduction in rates of groundwater from the aquifer. Examples would be if groundwater is discharging to streams, lakes, or oceans, you could reduce that discharge. And if water is being used by what we call phreatophytes or plants that use groundwater, by lowering the water table, those plants won't be able to pull as much water up. And so you would reduce the groundwater evapotranspiration. And the way that you could increase inflow rates are, you could actually have a stream supply water to the aquifer where once it was receiving water from the aquifer. So you're causing the stream for as much water as it has to lose some or all of it to the aquifer. And then there's another mechanism called rejected recharge, where the water's at or near land surface and you get rainfall or snow melt. It can't go into the aquifer because there's no room for storing it because the water table's right at land surface. But if you lowered the water table, now you could recharge some of that.
Right.
So that's the way that works. All right, go ahead, next slide. Reba showed one like this. This is from a USGS report where initially you have water flowing to a stream. It's recharging at the water table, and then stream is a low point in the system. So it would be recharging the stream and contributing to base flow in the stream. And then once a well is put in, as Reba said earlier, you have a cone of depression, but perhaps it hasn't reached far enough out to reduce the inflow to the stream, and the pumping is being supplied totally by a change in storage. And then at some further point of pumping, you begin to change the gradient to the stream so it's not as steep as it was before. And you're reducing the groundwater discharge to the stream. And then in extreme cases, you can actually reverse the gradient. So now water is flowing from the stream to the well. So that's captured groundwater discharge. Plus, we call this induced infiltration. So the well is actually inducing further loss of water from the stream. Okay, next slide. Here's an example water budget from the Southern High Plains Aquifer, kind of in schematic form. Initially, the system before development, you could have 24 million cubic feet per day recharging the aquifer naturally from deep percolation of water coming on the land surface. And then under steady state conditions, the natural discharge would be that same number, because in equals out. But with pumping, you have a whole new water budget. And you see in this case, natural discharge is only 10 million cubic feet per day. We could see that in the High Plains Aquifer, it's interesting to look at the magnitude of pumpage in comparison to the original natural recharge. So it's very, very highly pumped, and it's has the ability to profoundly change the natural discharge to the system. Okay, next slide. And here's the graph that Reba showed. And again, there's only two curves, so these are the only sources of water to a well. And this point where they cross, we just use that as kind of a reference point. It's nothing magical about it, but to the left of that, we call that storage dominated supply, and to the right, depletion dominated supply. And then if you pump long enough, when this goes up to 100% of the water being supplied by water from stream flow depletion, that's a new steady state condition. No water is being taken from storage. All of the water is coming from capture of mostly outflow. And I didn't put any time scale on this graph because it can vary, and it's dependent on the aquifer properties and the distance from the well to the connected surface water features. Okay, next slide. To just show you differences in the magnitude of these, how long it takes for this process to occur. It's very largely dependent. The most important factor is the distance from the well to the stream. And my colleague, Paul Barlow, he lives in Rhode Island. And this is an example of a small basin you could see that this scale, that's only 1 mile. So this whole basin could be a couple miles wide and wider in some other places. But he's showing in less than a year, this might be about a year, he's reaching a new steady state where all the water from these pumping wells, and these curves represent from different wells. Just because the system is fairly small and the wells are close to streams, you get all the water being pumped is being taken from streams within that time frame. Okay, next slide. And this is in southeast Arizona, where I live, the San Pedro River Basin. Have a couple wells, a couple hypothetical wells in here somewhere, but this is a stream right here. And this scale is much bigger. You can see that I'm looking at these curves over periods of decades. This is 100 years and it still hasn't reached steady state. But a substantial amount of water is being captured. This well A, yeah, I think they're right. Yeah, A and B. Well, A is closer to the stream, so it captures faster than well B. But you can see just how different these two areas are, kind of based on the scale of the system. Next slide. Now, a question to consider: when a well or wells stop pumping, does stream flow depletion stop immediately? Next slide. The answer to that is no, unless the well is very close to the stream. So again, it's dependent on that distance factor of the well to the stream. But depletion from pumping continues after pumping stops. In fact, the maximum rate of depletion could occur after pumping stops, because the cone of depression is still moving outwards when you stop pumping. But in this upper graph, we see that we've created this cone of depression. And then if we stop pumping, that cone of depression is kind of going back to its original water level. But at different points in time, the water that was going to the stream originally now has to go to fill in that cone of depression. So here, the bottom sketch shows that the cone of depression completely filled in, and all of that had to occur after pumping stopped. So it took a lot of water from the stream even after pumping stops. Okay, next slide. So to figure out the timing and how much a well is going to affect a spring or stream, we have to usually use basin scale groundwater flow models. And yeah, there's an example. So this might be a hypothetical aquifer with a stream and a couple tributaries. And what we do is we divide that into, we call them model cells. Usually they're rectangular in shape. And this one, we have 2 layers of cells to get the full depth of the aquifer. And a stream might traverse some of the cells. Have those shaded in darker blue here. And then we may have wells in the system in this orangish color. We can assume that this aquifer maybe goes way downstream, and we might not want to model the whole 30 or 50 miles of the aquifer. So sometimes hydrologists will kind of cut the model off, and that lower boundary where it says groundwater underflow out, that would be an artificial boundary that doesn't actually exist in the real world. They have to try and configure that. So if you're trying to figure out the effect of pumping by well B, for example, this artificial boundary doesn't influence those calculations. And well A is probably not a problem because it's got different streams and tributaries around it, and that won't be affected by what happens near that artificial boundary. Next slide. This is the slide that Reba showed. We call this pre-development or steady state. And the colors here represent the elevation of the water table, with kind of darker colors on the left being higher elevation, and the yellows being a lower elevation. So we usually start off a groundwater model with what we call steady state, and then we begin to impose pumping on it through time to see the effect of that. These slides were done, I'd like to acknowledge our colleague Carolyn Lambert, who did the heavy lifting on running the model. This is the state's groundwater model that Reba mentioned. And here we have contours of water level decline. I believe these are in feet. Yeah, these are in feet. So we have, as Reba was pointing out, 50 feet around most of the Lerwick wells. And the drawdown contours extending into the area of springs. And we would have effects of the pumping by 2060, according to this model, anyhow. Okay, next slide. And here's a bigger picture using colors to show drawdown. There's also contours there, but this is called a baseline simulation, where they have to kind of figure out how pumping is going to change through time, in this case up to the year 2060. And you can see these red dots are the pumping centers, and the actual drawdown, according to this, is meters. So that's over 200 meters. It's a huge drawdown by the year 2060. Okay, next slide. Just run over a few key points from this. The only source of water to wells is removal from storage in the aquifer, and increase inflow to the aquifer and decrease outflow from the aquifer. And those last two things we call stream flow depletion or capture. And the time that significant capture occurs is strongly influenced by the distance from the pumping well to connected surface water. And groundwater pumping can have long-term effects on streams and springs, commonly lasting long after the wells have been shut off. So it's kind of hard to manage for stream flow depletion because of that. Because you could be monitoring water levels and say, oh, we're having an effect. But even at that point, you're going to have residual effects that go way out into the future. And it looks like I repeated this point. Anyway, that was what I had to say.
Hello. Reba, am I on?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm Alan Kirkbride, not Lindy, as it says right there, because I'm using my wife's computer. And I live on Sprague Creek, which is the westernmost of the three most threatened springs and on those maps. The family came in 1889, little correction there. That's a year before statehood. And we persisted by living within our means. And one of my big points is, you know, if you didn't have enough money for a new truck, you didn't get a new truck. And it was extremely frugal in the early days. And then we've prospered and done fine. But this is right now we are at the, I think we're at the front end of a big problem in the whole West. And that's why we've kind of brought this whole case before you. When we really appreciate you being listening ears. Reba's done a wonderful job representing us. A couple other attorneys have too. And Stan's expertise has been invaluable and has lent great credibility to the case. But there's a sort of a drama right before us is what's the state engineer going to do? And he has the authority to grant any or all permits or decline them. And if he does, we just can't let it rest. We need to have no more groundwater development, we think, in this area. And this is looking now off my driveway, and you see the higher ground in the background goes up on the divide where these wells are. So, and in between us is Sprague Creek, which is the stream is always run, and it's been wonderful, and it's got all kinds of, it supports the usual high plains ecosystem, which includes cattail colonies. We got a lot of cattails, which are a great source of carbon capture, a natural source, among other things, among other aquatic plants. But we have, what was I going to say something about that? And that orchid that was mentioned, and then Rue had in there, which is an endangered plant. Well, you know what? I think that I would say that is one thing that's kind of significant is, you know, how many ranchers have put conservation easements on their places. It gives you the idea that they're looking at it not as a business model to be exploited, but rather as stewards. And I certainly view my time on the ranch as a steward. And one of my main jobs is to take care of the place, also to take care of the business end of the place, because I'd like to pass it on to these guys if they want to do it. And so we have an 8-family business here with ranging from mid-70s to we got our youngest guy, 24. Man, are we glad to have him. And so, caring for the whole place just really requires not depleting it. It's the whole principle of, and I think these are lessons and they're fights that the whole West is going to experience. And in a way, we are lucky that we are on the very northern tip of this development because we still got our springs going, because they haven't quite pumped all the water just in the high ground above us. However, you know, what these wells are being proposed for is a very marginal agricultural operation or application. The soil is not great where they're would put it in. If you just, I mean, they had one well and finally turned it off because they weren't making any money on it. And it was costing as much to develop and pump and farm as they could get out of it. It's just not a great place for it. If it's a good place anyway, I mean, there's a lot of questions about pumping precious groundwater out on very marginal ag applications. But there's opportunity there. And these applications have been applied for because there are other opportunities for the use of the water. One of which was we've really got some oil development going. There's a use for frack water, and while it's abundant, well, they've been using fresh water for that. But golly, shouldn't that be? There are also technologies now to reuse water, and shouldn't we be doing that with this precious water? Another thing is to sell this water from municipalities. The thing would be a bonanza if these were granted, not for the express purpose of agriculture as has been expressed, but for the value of the resource in other applications. Now, I like these neighbors who've applied for the wells, and I do not wish them any ill, but I think it's cavalier to think that it isn't going to really affect the whole community and the environment, the ecosystem, and wildlife. These pictures just kind of show, you know. Oh, another thing I was going to mention, I think it is what I was thinking earlier. This is an area of 13 to 15 inches of annual precipitation. It's semi-arid, and that's kind of a significant thing that it's not a 30 or 40 inch deal here, but that makes the ecosystem really has nice native grasslands within that parameter of precipitation, but it doesn't make dryland corn very good or hardly at all. And excuse me, my wife said something to me, distracted me. Well, so it's just a poor. It's a place for the native grasses are really what's natural. I mean, 132 years we've been on this place. It works with what we're doing, and I don't want to discount what other people might want to do, but I'm telling you that this is pretty serious to us, and we'd like to have it continue. These are some other pictures of some of our land and some of the area, and I think we've had a lot of verbiage here. I'd be glad to answer any questions, but I think I'll quit right now.
Thank you all so much. Extremely informative, and I think that, you know, while it's very specific to where you all are in Wyoming, actually has a lot of relevance to what folks are experiencing in a lot of other places in the West.